Hello and welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. As always, Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I talk about the recent FDA Pharmacologic Drugs Advisory Committee meeting that resulted in a majority vote against the approval of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD based on the MAPS Lykos study data. Reid and I discuss what the committee's concerns were, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, or ICER's, criticisms of the studies, the challenges generally of conducting psychedelic clinical trials, the phenomenon of functional unblinding in double-blind placebo-controlled trials, how researcher and rater bias can affect study data, and much, much more. A few announcements here before we get into the episode. The Numinus training team has an upcoming course in July of 2024 on psychedelic harm reduction and integration. I'd highly recommend you take this introductory course if you're looking for an overview of how to begin supporting clients in psychedelic work and building a career in this space. It's only 10 hours long, and you get great opportunities to discuss how providers are currently offering support to folks that are seeking psychedelic experiences or integration support to folks that are returning from having a psychedelic experience. I also love that you build great connections with your classmates who are looking to do the same thing in this work. So if you're interested, click on the links in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training. You can use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings there on the site. Of course, we talk about clinical trials today in the show. We do and continue to do psychedelic clinical trials here at Numinus. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. Without further ado, here's today's episode. And we're back. Another episode of Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. Reid, thank you for holding down the fort while I was gone.
Welcome back, Steve.
Thanks.
We missed you.
A great trip. I'm still a little jet lagged, to be honest. I'll do my best to be relatively articulate today. But yeah, had a great trip. And you had really great interviews while I was gone. I've listened to both. That was really enjoyable.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, of course.
Steve.
Yeah, not only a client of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, but also the founder. No, I loved your interviews. I thought they were really informative and interesting.
Yeah, those were super fun, and I'm glad to be back in this format too, having our conversations in the same room. How it all began. Probably how it'll end, but. When will it end?
Let's
not go there.
We're just going to keep going.
Yeah.
As long as everybody listens, we'll keep going.
Yeah, don't worry. There is no planned end,
no plan.
People. We enjoy this, so thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we thought we might try to tackle something a little, I don't know if you would call it time sensitive, but it is in the news, in the psychedelic therapy world right now. And it might make sense for a podcast such as ours to talk about it a little bit.
It has definitely been in the news. We're talking about the Lykos FDA drama, if you will. Drama not being the right term, but I just like saying drama.
It has felt a little dramatic. Yeah. I mean, certainly. So what we're talking about is back on, what was it, June 4th, that the FDA Psychopharmacologic Drugs Advisory Committee, the PDAC, met to discuss the trials.
For 9 hours.
Yeah. It was live streamed on YouTube. I heard one person say that it was the most viewed meeting of this type that they've ever had.
For sure.
I think it was like over 1,000 people tuned in for the live stream on YouTube.
I've been around clinical trials for a while. Like I've 15 years now, 250 plus or so in, and I have never seen a meeting like that come to even a fraction of that public attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. And you know, we've gotten a lot of questions about this since, because the headline was, you know, FDA shoots down MAPS MDMA, you know, hopes of getting this, but that wasn't what the meeting was about, right? This is an advisory committee that meets to go over the science and make a recommendation to the FDA, leading up to their eventual decision in August about whether or not to FDA approve MDMA as a medicine.
And as has been reported in the news, if you've been following, the FDA usually, but not always, follows that recommendation historically, like 75% of the time over the recent years looked at. So I guess that's one question. Is all lost?
Definitely not.
No. And and we'll talk about this perhaps later, but even if the FDA does not approve MDMA-assisted therapy in August, all is not lost. It doesn't mean it's never approved.
Right.
Yeah. And we can speculate about what that might look like. But,
yeah. So these committees are typically constructed of a variety of people from different expertise, right? So it's got research scientists on there. It's got clinicians. Sometimes it'll have, people from the healthcare industry, and then also clients or participants from the research or people who've benefited from the treatment, something like that, right? Like, isn't it comprised of a bunch of different types of
and there
special
is
interests?
like a consumer / prototypical patient, but I believe that's one member of the committee who does not have a vote. Yeah. But regardless, the votes were overwhelmingly against approving MDMA from this committee, this pre-approval committee hearing, if you will.
Right. Yeah, I have that written down because they were going to vote on two things: its effectiveness and then the safety, like whether or not the data indicate with the combination of a REMS that the risks, that the benefits outweigh the risks. So they voted 2-9 against effectiveness and 1-10 against the assertion that the benefits outweigh the risks.
Mm-hmm. And why this matters is not only because there has not been a new drug approval for PTSD in 25 years. Our options are seriously lacking, even the ones we do have. And people are suffering, like 13 million Americans living with PTSD. So that's, I get the chills just talking about that. Like that's the biggest thing for me and the industry as a whole. We're in this new era of this new chapter of the psychedelic renaissance, if you will, where the first big medicine in the spotlight is coming up for potential approval.
Right.
And what does this mean for psilocybin that's coming down the pipeline next and everything else? Like there are over 200 registered psychedelic clinical trials. So there's a lot on the line. A lot of people are paying attention for that reason too.
Yeah. Well, and I think that was one of the reasons why MDMA and psilocybin were granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA, right? And that these trials were allowed to be fast-tracked.
And that, interestingly, gives the drug developer, MAPS, now called Lykos, or in those other instances, Compass and Usona, gives them kind of priority access along the way to the FDA, like quicker meetings. They can essentially pick up the phone and ask. And there was back in, it's wild, it's 7 years now, but like 2017, a special protocol meeting that MAPS had with the FDA saying, here's what we're going to do. Does this seem okay? Yeah. And so some of the issues that came up in that June 4th hearing, that committee meeting, and issues that were raised very soon before that or in and around that same time by ICER that we'll talk about. Some of those are perhaps a bit unfair, important issues, but apply to the field as a whole. Like, for example, what do we do about blinding in psychedelic trials? And trials in general, like that's, I've had to look at this for a long time. And then also some of the design issues, like the ICER report was was criticizing the use of the CAPS-5, for example, as the primary outcome measure, a PTSD rating scale. And criticism may be valid, but the fact of the matter is that's what every PTSD trial has used and uses, and what else were they supposed to use? And the FDA, saw that in their protocol and said, fine, yeah.
Right.
Like, because what else are they going to do? Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting that the committee, to your point, criticized study design, a study design that was what would you say, sanctioned by the FDA, and that MAPS actually worked pretty closely, if I understand correctly, with the FDA in sort of landing on that particular design.
Yeah.
And I guess, like you're saying, because they're at the tip of the spear, MAPS in this study is taking the brunt of criticism that is really criticism of, like you say, the entire, not only psychedelic medicine design, research design industry, but like how you would study almost any drug.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, blinding and unblinding is a challenge for like almost all of our psych medicines, not just psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah. And what do they say? The first through the wall is the bloodiest.
Right.
Wherever that expression comes from, it's true and makes intuitive sense. And MAPS, Lykos has been taking a beating, and the whole, some of it unfair, some of it, valid and, needs to be discussed and addressed. And hopefully this opens up that discussion in advance of the August committee hearing, right? The real approval decision, not committee hearing, but to go back to that 2017 protocol meeting they had with the FDA, it was discussed back then. Does the CAPS-5 make sense? Yes, because that's what other trials have used and use for this indication, PTSD. And they had a discussion even back then of what constitutes a clinically meaningful response, because it wasn't part of the CAPS-5 original publications and design, and it's best suited and originally used with veterans, for example. And they did agree on 10 points back then in 2017 being a clinically meaningful response. And so I would find it extremely tragic and unfortunate if MDMA were tabled, delayed, or not approved because of some of these issues that were known and apply to any other drug, and MDMA is taking the unfair brunt of it. All that being said, we have to pay attention to good quality clinical trial data and safety of the people if something's going to roll out, especially something people are enthusiastically waiting for. Right. Yeah.
So do you know what the exact criticism was about using the CAPS-5? Because if it is the gold standard, is it because the CAPS-5 measures PTSD symptoms relative to an index trauma, like one specific trauma?
Yeah. So with PTSD, it's interesting because, like, if you really dissect the DSM-5 criteria and these rating scales, they'll need something at first to hinge it on. And in this case, even if you have multiple traumas, you have to pick like the first or the biggest, an index event. And some of the critique by the ICER's report was that this was originally designed for veterans, and does it apply to complex kind of multi-trauma chronic PTSD, for example? Mm-hmm. I think that debate has been had already, and it has been used for that in other studies. But the thing with the report is they had heard anecdotally that some participants may have had some improvement around the index event, but some destabilization more generally, or trouble in other areas. And that one just brings up more questions for me than, I don't know that it's a valid critique in that, the CAPS-5 measures your PTSD symptom burden, even though it does pin things on an index event. You're looking at over the past X number of days, how have your symptoms been across these domains of PTSD? And so it's not going to isolate itself to just symptoms. It's impossible to isolate it just symptoms to one event because the symptoms of PTSD are the same across events. So I think it's just a overall concern of of how much you can apply this to the both the general population and the non-combat related PTSD, even though the phase 3 studies had plenty of both in their data set.
And they used other measures, right? The CAPS-5 was what they used for the primary endpoint, right? But didn't they use like the back depression inventory and the
PCL-5,
global rating scale, and
there are other self-report measures, and there's the clinical global impression, like both from the clinician side and the patient side of compared to when you began this study, how much improvement has there been overall. And even though it seems like such a quick and brief measure, it's pretty damn useful in clinical trials and is used in pretty much every one I've worked on,
right,
because it takes into account data from multiple sources in a pretty smart way.
Yeah.
And so MAPS did use central raters for the CAPS-5, like a lot of our psilocybin studies are doing, and even some of the other psychedelic, non-psychedelic clinical trials. It's becoming more and more common to have a group of raters who are not at risk for functional unblinding, like people on at the study site, whether functional unblinding meaning accidentally knowing what the participant got or having a good guess based on their reported experience or their side effects, adverse events. Yeah. Like someone sitting there an hour after you give them a classic psychedelic in a clinical trial, if they start saying like,
the walls are melting.
Yeah. Or I had a patient once, after I gave them ketamine, say, "Whoa, you look like you have 8 heads right now."
Yeah, and you wouldn't expect that to happen if you gave somebody a placebo, a sugar pill, basically.
Yeah, and that data was looked at and kind of dissected a bit in the committee hearing and the ICER's report, where in one of the studies, I think it was like 75% knew what they were on, and another study, 90-something% knew what they were on. There are countless papers even in recent years talking about the challenge of clinical trial design in psychedelics because of that, and possible solutions. But the thing is, like, if you really threw out a medicine because of concerns with blinding, like, would you ever have any chemotherapy approved? Would you have a knee surgery approved, right? Like, or any psych drug for that matter. Like, it has its extra challenges in psychedelics for sure, but I think the question wants to get at, is all or too much of this benefit seen in the clinical trials attributable to bias and unblinding and expectancy of like clinical teams and the participants themselves, in the context of a medicine with what they called in some of these meetings a cult-like following.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was one thing when I was reading the ICER critique. I could be wrong about this, but I don't think that they acknowledged that MAPS used central raters, because I thought that they, in their criticism of the study team being biased due to unblinding concerns, that part of that bias would then influence the way that they that the improvement was rated on the scales. But if the scales are conducted, as you say, by independent central raters, meaning people who weren't present for any of the actual study, then theoretically that solves that unblinding problem, at least for the rating scale.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, there's still a risk of unblinding your central rater. But there are ways of measuring this too. I even was reading the other day a Spravato paper that looked at S-ketamine, studies that had both, there were a few studies done along the way that had both local ratings and central kind of extra blinded raters, if you will, and looked at good correlation and found good correlation between them, and saw like that this is a good strategy to have those central raters. The other reason is what's called inter-rater reliability. Right. I've done a number of PTSD trials. There aren't enough of them, and virtually all of them going up for FDA approval in recent years have failed. I'm talking about besides MDMA, that one's to be determined. But at the investigator meeting for those trials, we would receive like a deep dive on CAPS-5 training. Even if I've done it many times before, you have to get certified for that study. They'd bring out, I think it was Frank Williams who wrote the scale from like the Boston VA, and a team of people, trainers, who also act as central raters for trials like the MAPS trial even. Right. So they are the best of the best of that scale, and no instrument is perfect. Our diagnoses are definitely not perfect, but these are not new issues. That CAPS-5 one, for example. Yeah. So there was the functional unblinding. You've been digesting a lot of these news. What other issues did you highlight? I've got a handful to discuss as well.
Well, and this is related to unblinding, but their critique of the therapists and the therapy being that the therapist team, again, I think this was the critique. The therapist team was constructed of people who are really enthusiastic about this medicine, and that they weren't able to contain their enthusiasm, and they might have influenced the study participants by saying things like, "Oh, your worsening symptoms are actually signs that you're getting better. You're going to get worse before you get better," and that might have influenced the way that the study participants reported their symptoms on the scales. And they even went so far as to describe it as like a cult of psychotherapy. That the focus on the inner healing intelligence or whatever it was too psychospiritual. And that the participants themselves, I think it was up to 40% of the participants in the active study drug group had experienced MDMA before. And so that, the assumption being that if somebody had taken MDMA illicitly and had a negative experience, they're probably not going to volunteer for a study on MDMA as a treatment. So these people might have been, coming in favorably biased. Those were some of the other critiques.
What do you recall what the percentage was? Was it similar in the placebo group?
I didn't read a percentage about the placebo
because
group. Yeah.
You would imagine it would
evenly
be
split
because it's randomized, right? Like it would be like very surprising if it weren't, because that's how clinical trials work, by a roll of the dice, a randomization button, practically speaking, that puts people into a group.
So I don't know, but this is also related to other critiques about the therapy itself.
Yeah.
And, we knew this going into, and we'd said it many times on this podcast, other people in the field have talked about this, but the idea that the FDA has never approved a drug that is being studied in conjunction with psychotherapy. The FDA doesn't regulate psychotherapy or make recommendations about psychotherapy.
And I'll admit that psychotherapy tied to psychedelics is a unique challenge. Like there is precedent for testing psychotherapies, of course, finding how it does on outcome measures and safety, tolerability, and all that. But it is an issue, and a lot of people have been talking about the bursting of the hype bubble, and there have even been some analyses looking at these therapists' biases. But it's interesting along the way. When I started working with MAPS, they brought me in as their coordinating investigator of the eating disorder study, which was not a formal FDA pathway, at least at this stage, but kind of one of the next indications of interest to explore in the meantime. And there was good donor money to support it. And what I found really interesting was that the sites picked for that study were picked because there were MAPS trained therapists in that area. They essentially built sites around the trained therapists that generally had not done previous clinical trials. There are two ways you could do it. You could find research sites that know how to do clinical trials and either train or insert therapists, or you could, because therapist training bottlenecks and takes a while, and MAPS had their network of solid, trusted therapists, and in this case, those with eating disorder experience too. It was even a little trickier. I made the decision to build sites around it, and one of my roles, besides helping get that through the FDA and Health Health Canada for approval to do the study was to train the study teams, most of which had not, and this is again not on the PTSD one, the eating disorder one, but I believe the same applied to PTSD studies. But clinical trials are complex and labor intensive, and you don't just get into clinical trials overnight. Typically I'd say most of the time when a drug company says, I'm going to do a clinical trial, even if they know clinical trials very well, they're a massive, well-established drug company, they'll still usually engage what's called a CRO to manage the study. Contract research organization that picks the sites, monitors them, and basically is contracted to run the studies for the drug developer. MAPS did not use a CRO. So they were a nonprofit learning to be a drug developer and a CRO, picking sites that didn't have experience. So they had their work cut out for them, and it took them longer because of it. And that's not to say it can't be done. They did it. But it also may be part of the reason why they're getting extra scrutiny here. And part of the remedy may be going to those sites and pulling a lot of the detailed data to look at were AEs really reported as required, as expected, and as required by good clinical practices and research standards. And there are tons of those standards. I made with MAPS back then, like a 200 slide deck for training these research teams over months. We'd meet regularly because, if you're an established research site, you might have like certified or well-trained clinical research coordinators and PIs who have PI'd many studies. You kind of have to be in that field. There's a standard set.
Yeah. So you bring up AEs, or adverse events, and that was another one of the critiques from ICER, is that they, and this was based on, they even said in the report, like people we've talked to. And
I don't know, that bugged me a little bit. All the anecdotal concerns.
Lots of anecdotal, and it's not to say that they didn't hear these things. Like,
they're valid concerns.
Certainly valid concerns. And if we were to back up just for a second, it's important that you mentioned clinical trials are complex. We're not using that as an excuse to excuse the shortcomings of this particular study design or the outcomes. Like, bias could have been present. All the things that the ICER is concerned about could be 100% valid. Like, the reason the FDA exists is to protect us from shitty drugs that could hurt us, right?
Before we had this system, things were an ethical hot mess. Yeah.
So it's important that the MAPS is getting this level of scrutiny. We just don't want to, my opinion as it's evolving in real time, it does need to be fair.
Yeah. And some of the arguments are either unfair or exaggerated, or Lykos is just taking the brunt of it.
Right.
Yeah. As the first up. Yeah. And with this history of like Rick Doblin.
Schedule 1 drug too. Like, this is a little different.
Yeah. Rick Doblin founding this nonprofit on this valiant crusade to help people with PTSD and bring, he also is like a tireless activist. And we, when we had a conversation with him, I guess it's been a few months now on this podcast, I was really inspired by, his crusade on a number of different levels to undo some of these injustices, and the stories he told about having to duke it out with the governing bodies along the way. I imagine while, this would be disappointing, not surprising to him.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I guess that's part of the concern of the concerned folks, like the ICER folks, is that you have an activist running a study. Are we so sure that activism bias isn't seeping into the way that they interacted with the participants and reporting the AEs, the adverse events? And that was one of the concerns based on the people that they talked to, the quote unquote hearsay, is that because the therapists and the study team were so enthusiastic about MDMA that they might have either deliberately or maybe unconsciously influenced the underreporting of adverse events. And then the criticisms that are a little bit more targeted and critical are, that MAPS and the study team actually suppressed reporting adverse events. Like, if you're not doing well, don't say anything.
Yeah.
And that would surprise me.
It would me too. Like, knowing a lot of the researchers, a lot of the study teams, and, having a decent but not perfect radar for people's kind of honesty and integrity, and knowing this clinical trials field very well. Like, yeah, there were some damn good, well-meaning researchers involved, and it was not easy to get involved in that study. And I think they were doing it to the best of their ability. And there are these issues. Like, I don't think there's some malicious, like, skeleton in the closet, even though there were harms, like some, like, sexual abuse allegations that, of course, need to be taken seriously, or a terrible thing to show up in clinical trials, especially this one. But that wasn't MAP's intention going into this, for sure. Yeah.
So I know we're a little all over the place, but another point entering my mind that I wanted to make earlier about the study design and the placebo-controlled double-blind study design. I think there was one recommendation or a critique that in specific to whether or not it's the psychotherapy that's doing the heavy lifting or the drug doing the heavy lifting, combination of the two, like, how do you measure that? How do you separate them? They thought that maybe having a drug only group might have been useful. So you have the placebo group that gets the placebo medicine and the therapy, the active study condition, active study drug and therapy. What about a group that just gets the drug?
Was useful, and it brings up the question of, is it ethical?
Right.
But like I think you were alluding to earlier, we've talked about the psychotherapy debate on here, a bit of time ago, looking at a Compass paper and some other things. And also we work with a number of drug developers who are approaching this in different ways, right? Of emphasizing and de-emphasizing the psychotherapy or the formal psychotherapy, because it is complicated and it is not what the FDA is used to, and it does introduce more potential variables to have multiple dosing sessions, multiple integration in between each, preparation, and how do you control for all those variables across 12 weeks with all that in the mix? You control the best you can, and you analyze it in the most solid, robust, acceptable way as possible, and I guess you debate these things, right? But what I find interesting is that back in 2019, I think it was, there was a MAPS conference. Maybe this was 2019 in the fall. MAPS conference in Austin that I went to, and Rick Doblin was giving a talk there about the MDMA therapy clinical trial progress so far, and he was telling the story about how initially the FDA had asked them to use an active placebo, meaning like a little fraction of a dose of MDMA in their placebo group, say 20 milligrams in the placebo group and say 200 milligrams in the active group. I'm rounding some of the numbers here, but in the interim analyses along the way, MAPS was seeing that people in the active placebo group who got 20 milligrams were doing a little worse than if they had just gotten a sugar pill, because there was overactivation because of the stimulant nature of MDMA, because they theorize, right? This isn't like totally proven, but I think is a totally valid, sound theory, is overactivation without the fear reduction that comes from having the right dose of MDMA on board. And therefore, the next round of clinical trials all had totally inactive placebo. And that's how it goes in these studies. Like some of our psilocybin studies have used niacin as an active placebo, if you will. Some have used nothing, right? And ketamine studies back in the day, and they're still done this way, will use something like midazolam, a strong benzo, as the placebo. Or if you do a TMS study, it's called sham, a noisy helmet you put on that sounds like TMS.
Right.
So I'm not going to know if I'm getting TMS. Will I have a guess? Maybe. And some people, like, I think that's a challenge with any study.
Yeah, I mean, they've even with orthopedic surgery, they'll do sham surgeries and even do a little incision on the knee, but not actually do the orthoscopics and actually the repair. And people will report that their knees feel better. Like, the placebo effect is real for sure. And you only do so much to control for it.
Exactly. And yes, it's a special issue with psychedelic medicines, and therefore, like, it's an extra important issue that I don't think is, we have to cut through it and get to the data that's comfortable enough for the FDA to approve it. I understand that, but like, if this is always an insurmountable issue, then no psychedelic drug could ever get approved, and so many other categories, no psychiatric drug for that matter, and a lot of these other things. But there was a fun study I came across once on the placebo. Like, it was called Trippin' on Nothing. That's the PubMed title, but I think it was in Montreal, where researchers gave people placebo or a psychedelic, and they spent 4 hours in a room with colored lights, a DJ, and it was like a party scene. So this is 33 participants who were told they'd be given a drug like psychedelic mushrooms and would experience changes in their consciousness over 4 hours. But in reality, and I misspoke, in reality, everyone got placebo.
Oh, okay.
And so, and some, there were in the group, and this is also interesting study design, some were trained to act out, like some were planted to act out tripping. But of the people, who were told they'd get a psychedelic and got nothing in this party room, 61% reported some effect from the drug.
Interesting.
And, it highlights the suggestibility and power context in an extreme study example. But I'll also admit that, we do a lot of these studies, and nowadays the studies do ask, what do you think you got? And it's really interesting data, because, we don't always know.
Right.
We don't always know. But many people can guess and have a pretty good guess. Understandably.
Right.
Yeah.
So backing up a little bit, they voted no on efficacy and safety. And that was safety, even in the context of having a REMS, like the risk evaluation management strategy or whatever that comes out with drugs like this. And so it just, again, seems a little surprising that based on MAPS's data, that they would say that the study design was so flawed and their bias was so influential that we could throw out the positive, results of 80-something% of people, no longer met diagnostic criteria for PTSD, and that this drug is so dangerous that the reported potential adverse events, that it wouldn't be a risk worth the risk. And
I think we need to look at it in the context of, it's almost like a jury, and you can sway a jury, and there's peer pressure going on, if you will. And this comes at a time when there's a petition going around against MAPS Lykos by some kind of fired up citizens, who have concerns about harms in trials and all these other things, but pretty vocal concerns. And like, if you're on a committee, you might find yourself even subconsciously hesitating, voting in favor of a medicine that is like taking a public beating like that, for one. And then also, I think the standard is more of like, like, do we know that this is not harmful, or do we know? And the way I read, like the ICER report, for example, is, and I have a part of it here that shows this. The ICER report said, if the results reported by Lykos in its 2 phase 2 studies are reflective of the expected outcomes of MDMA-assisted therapy, it would be an important addition to the treatment options.
Right.
So they said, like, if this is accurate, cool, give it to people, it'll help. It'll be a great addition to a field that desperately needs it. But, and they said, however, and this is the kicker, they have substantial concerns about the validity of results. The concerns surface through its engagement with stakeholders that could potentially affect the interpretation of the evidence, like by interviews with those with firsthand knowledge of the trials.
Right.
So I think it brought up concerns where they cannot get behind that data, because they can't trust the data enough to give it their stamp of approval.
Right.
Because of these unresolved concerns, unfinished business, if you will, in the drama that's going on and the scrutiny.
Right.
Yeah.
So elsewhere in that report, I've got this little quote. ICER is not able to assess the frequency of misreporting of benefits and or harms, and thus the overall balance of net benefit with MDMA-AP. As such, we conclude that the current publicly available evidence of MDMA-AP, AP meaning assisted psychotherapy, is insufficient. Given this, the evidence is also insufficient to compare MDMA-AP with trauma-focused psychotherapies. So again, it's not that they had overwhelming evidence that the study was bad. It's that there was enough evidence for them to say, we can't say with confidence that the study was good enough.
Yeah. And maybe, I don't know if we adequately explained what ICER is at the beginning, and maybe we did, but really. The timing is just, I think, relevant here. And the ICER report is this kind of more formal report that comes in the middle of this, I think it's 6 to 12 month period of like reviewing this that ICER is doing. So it's not done,
right.
But, and they are interviewing stakeholders, but they did happen to release this report around the same time, a little bit before. I think it was like end of May that their report, sometime in May it came out. And ICER is an independent nonprofit funded to look at if drugs, pre-approved and approved ones, especially those going up for approval, if they are safe, effective, and make sense from a cost standpoint.
Right.
And that's what they do.
Which, yeah. and I wasn't, being a psychotherapist, not really involved in drug development until I got involved in psychedelics.
Yeah.
Didn't really know much about ICER. So the idea of an independent nonprofit that is looking carefully at studies like this it sounds amazing. Sounds like a really, really important way to protect the public from what could be really dangerous drugs. So I like the idea of this independent organization looking carefully.
But also has its own biases, like everyone. Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, but so they had this public meeting end of May, like May 30th, and they have this report that came out, and they voted 14-1 in their latest end of May report, saying that the current evidence doesn't demonstrate that it is ready, meaning safe and effective and better, and that causes stir, and I think plays a role as well in this, in this committee, in this kind of drama that's ensued.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can I just take a minute and maybe reflect on the general tone of our conversation? Because I just got suddenly self-conscious. Because as you're listening, you can probably tell that Reid and I, well, I'll speak for me. I don't want to speak for you. So I'm really excited about MDMA-assisted therapy being approved. And, we've talked about our excitement on the show before. And I was excited about the data when it came out, and admittedly didn't personally take a deep dive into study design to see if there was any problems. I'm not an investigative journalist necessarily. So I'm certainly vulnerable to my own enthusiasm producing bias and being maybe overly cynical about ICER's report, or not have been one of the people that signed the petition, right? That being said, I am all on board for organizations taking a really close look, like I've tried to allude to a couple of times in this conversation, at studies like this to protect us, to make sure that when drugs are approved or therapies are approved, that they're not approved because the people doing the designs were super enthusiastic and weren't forthcoming about all the potential risks. Mm-hmm. So that being said, I don't know. I feel like if you're listening to this episode, you're probably getting the sense that Reid and I, again, I'll speak for myself, and then you can say that I don't know, that I don't think that the risks as reported outweigh the benefits, especially if it's rolled out with the REMS. That seems to be that's my, I guess, general opinion right now based on the available data that I've seen.
So if I'm understanding it right, and I love this pause and reflection, by the way, and I'll join you, but if I'm understanding you right, you're saying that you're just kind of admitting your enthusiasm and disappointment in like that committee hearing and result, the perhaps what might feel like excessive or unfair critique at times, but also admitting your own bias as a human and where you're coming from, and hoping for this as a tool for people and an undoing of the overscheduling and all that.
Yeah, because I would hate for my enthusiasm to result in a bias where I'm not willing to take a close enough look at the very real limitations of a particular study like this. I really believe in the potential of psychedelic-assisted therapies to help people, and maybe that belief clouds my vision a bit. I would hate for that to be the case. So I guess I'm just making a real-time observation and admitting my humanity here.
Yeah, I like it, and I agree. It's been a kind of a personal journey, a personal soapbox even, and personal kind of exploration and crusade to look at the risks of psychedelics in recent months, and to look at this hype carefully, because yes, I want new treatment options just like you, and yes, I think that it's there's all this social injustice historically, and the war on drugs has had unfortunate consequences over the past several decades, and there's a lot to talk about there and undo there, but I agree with you completely that I want my bias to always be on the table, open for examination, and I'll admit it every day, the potential biases, even as a researcher, especially as a researcher, right? Like that, yes, I geek out on data. I love good data. And I also know that in, certain circumstances, there's a saying in statistics, like you could torture the data to tell what you want to hear.
Right. Or garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, and I've seen clinical trial time and time again fail from bad study design, decisions, like some kind of research site inconsistencies, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I'll admit that I was, as I tuned in intermittently through the day to that hearing on June 4th, was felt disappointed, sad, a little fired up, wanting to debate some of those points. And I also feel like this is an important debate to have at an important time. And like we said, all is not lost. But let's move things forward in the best way possible, in the right way. And even if it takes another, and I'm getting more and more on board with this, like I feel a bit of impatience because people are suffering, and because this has been, we've had these Schedule 1 hoops to jump through for a long time, and it's easy to get frustrated with those, right? But even if it takes a few extra months or an extra year or something to get approved, like what is the right way to get it approved and roll it out, so that it can get to people in a safe and effective way? I'm on board with that, right? Yeah, and we don't know how it's going to play out.
No, August 11th will be, I'll be waiting with bated breath to see what the FDA says.
Kind of like an election day or something.
Yeah. Well, ideally, the studies that are done are thorough enough and the bias is controlled well enough that you can get a good sense for the potential risks of a treatment. And that with that good sense, you can create a risk mitigation strategy for those potential risks so that you can do an accurate calculus, that the benefits outweigh the risks and that you can mitigate those risks effectively. And my suspicion is that we can do that. We can do that with MDMA. We can do that with psilocybin and other psychedelics. And that suspicion is based on working with these medicines in clinical trials, my own personal experience with some of these medicines. So there's my bias. I am not the PhD researcher designing these trials and conducting these trials. My involvement in these trials has been as a therapist on these trials. And I'm not an academic psychologist, although my dissertation chair tried to make me one. But I do understand the scientific method. I do understand study design and to a lesser extent statistics. And so my hope is that the FDA and MAPS continue to work arm in arm and they figure these things out. Even if, as you say, that means more research, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. As long as the worst thing in the world would be that this stuff is totally tossed out, in my opinion, because I think there's so much promise.
Yeah, and I don't think that's on the table, even though it's understandable to have that fear or worry when you have a day like June 4th and those comments and that kind of a vote from an FDA Advisory Committee, right? But I think what's more likely to happen is, well, either the med gets approved with a serious REMS, risk evaluation mitigation system, like Spravato has, where it can only be given in clinic. There's a monitoring period. The drug gets shipped from special pharmacies to clinic. Everyone's registered. Every patient's registered. We've given thousands and thousands of doses of Spravato here in Utah, and there has never been an incident of like diversion by a patient in that because of the REMS, like thanks to the REMS, if you will. Like, and ketamine is a drug of abuse in many parts of the world, and is of concern. So we've kind of known all along that MDMA will, if approved, will need to come with a REMS and will likely be, even stricter than Spravato. But that is par for the course. And what troubles me is that like right now, if I have someone with severe debilitating PTSD and current available options have failed, where can I send them on the planet to get MDMA-assisted therapy? Like for right now, what is it, Australia?
Maybe Australia, and the infrastructure is not good, and it's really expensive. I mean, we did have that bill pass here in Utah, technically, that gives the University of Utah and Intermountain Healthcare the ability to do, was it psilocybin MDMA, but that's unlikely to actually work out.
I get asked about that a lot, and it's really kind of impressive that it could go forward and get to where it is, and certainly represents a step forward. But yeah, I'm pretty confident, very high confidence based on what I know is happening with the bill and at those organizations that technically could give it, that it has never been given to anyone under that bill yet. And there's not an easy, clear path, because when you have federal scheduling, making certain substances illegal, and not to mention procurement of the right substance in the right, regulatory way. And you have big organizations that are the only ones approved to give it. It's going to be tricky. Yeah, it's tricky to navigate. So
So nowhere on the planet to really send people reliably for MDMA. You know, we send our wounded warriors
legally,
to Brazil and Mexico and Central America for ibogaine and 5-MeO and ayahuasca, and that's another tragedy we've talked about, that we have, you know, veterans who are traumatized in service of their country, who have to leave their country in order to get effective treatment for their PTSD.
Yeah. And I used to have to do this with like kids with serious neurodevelopmental conditions and seizure disorders, to other states to get medical cannabis for their condition, until there were some, you know, state laws softening some loopholes. Like initially in Utah, it was, you know, only a neurologist could prescribe it or something like that. And now we have a medical cannabis program. And look at, like, on the bright side, and this also fuels some of the concerns, like the progress of kind of decriminalization, legalization of psychedelics appears to be more rapid than the progress of cannabis. And yeah, there are some concerns that these committees are bringing up around the hype and enthusiasm and the bias that may represent.
Yeah. So to say it again, it's important to have skeptics. It's important to have people who put the brakes on those of us who might be a little too enthusiastic. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Anything else that you want to reflect on, or anything you want to point out?
No, I think it's just worth mentioning that along the same lines as the progress, there is Measure 109 in Oregon that in full swing, where people can go get psilocybin therapy from a number of different organizations. You know, it may cost $1,000-$3,000 when you count the preparation and integration and dosing. But that seems like progress. There's also in Denver, what is it?
122.
That both decriminalized and kind of regulated, you know, the ability to receive in a clinic,
quote unquote healing centers.
Natural substances, like some plant-based psychedelics and fungi, but not MDMA.
Yeah, it's psilocybin now, and then I think in 2026 it's going to add DMT, ibogaine, and mescaline, non-peyote mescaline.
Yeah, and the, you know, there are multiple streams of this kind of psychedelic renaissance going on, like the religious ceremonial use of psilocybin and other plant medicines, for example, the decriminalization or deprioritizing the war on drugs to fight, you know, those substances and some of the inequality and injustice that's resulted from that war. And then there's also the medicalization that we're talking about here.
Right.
You know, I think these are all, you know, forging ahead. It may seem like, you know, we've hit a catastrophe along the way when there's a committee hearing, but you know, I do think it's, you know, another just bump in the road and chance to look at it and not all that unexpected or surprising.
Yeah. My suspicion and my hope is that it's a speed bump and not a brick wall.
Yep.
But if you're interested in how to like track the legalization status across the United States, is it psilocybin or Psychedelics Alpha, that website? They've got a pretty good tracker. And they actually published a response to the ICER report from the therapists that were involved in the MAPS study. And that we will, Jamie, if we can include a link, I'll send you a link to that response in the show notes. It's a good response. So this was opinion piece, group of clinical investigators, clinicians, supervisors, trainers, and mentors who worked on the phase 3 trials. And they kind of point by point, blow by blow, responded to ICER's critiques. So good balance.
Well, thanks for processing with me, Steve.
Indeed. Always a pleasure. Thanks, Reid. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus. a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.